Oh, yeah. Okay. Never mind. Do it without it. Okay. The title, you've heard a minute ago, memory as a component of the virtue of prudence, aretological aspect of reflection on memory. The issue of human memory can be approached in various ways, as evidenced by the interdisciplinary nature of our conference. In St. Thomas Aquinas' lecture on aretology, memory appears as the first component of the virtue of prudence. It is precisely the memory of past events that, as Aquinas notes, is the basis for awareness of future events. Therefore, in order to cope well with the future, one must remember events from the past. We'll discuss the issue of memory as an essential component of the virtue of prudence in 3 steps. Steps first, prudence as auriga virtutum, the place of prudence in the classical lecture of aretology. Step second, sensory memory and intellectual memory, human memory as a storehouse of images and concepts. And the third step, history as magistra vitae, the role of memory from the perspective of choosing the right means to achieve the intended good. Prudence as auriga virtutum, the place of prudence in the classical lecture on aretology. The history of reflection on the phenomenon of virtue dates back to pre-philosophical times. Already in Homer's poem, we find evidence of observation of the fact that individual people have established predispositions to certain behaviors. In particular, we can point here to the ability to fight effectively in defense of one's own homes in times of war, or to protect them from misfortunes in times of peace. This original connection between reflection on the phenomenon of virtue and manliness is reflected in the Latin translation of the Greek term arete as virtues, from vir, man. For the father of ethics, Socrates, virtue is above all phronesis, practical and ethical knowledge rooted in the depth of the human soul, where cognition and volition intertwine. The author of the first classification of virtues is Plato. This classification, comprising 4 virtues, was referred to in ancient Christianity by St. Ambrose. His catalogue of virtues, which he called cardinal virtues, became a permanent feature of Christian teaching. A classification different from Plato's, but also significant from the point of view of Christian aretology, is presented by Aristotle. This author divides virtues into 2 basic groups: ethical virtues, relating to the sensual side of human nature, and dialectic virtues, relating to the rational side of human nature. There are many ethical virtues, as he knows, just as there are many sensory impulses that reason should control. He mentions 2 dialectic virtues: wisdom as a virtue that perfects the working of theoretical reason, Greek sophia, and prudence, Greek phronesis, as a virtue that improves human practical cognition. In the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas creates an original synthesis of the above classifications, which remains the basis of Catholic aretology to this day. Each of the 4 cardinal virtues has its own entourage of accompanying virtues, so that in this context we can speak of a kind of procession of accompanying virtues surrounding the individual cardinal virtue. The place of the virtue of prudence in created by Aquinas' synthesis turns out to be special. Referring to the distinction between dialectic and ethical virtues introduced by Aristotle, Thomas discusses prudence as one of the intellectual virtues. At the same time, however, he is inclined to count prudence among ethical virtues. Still a small remark, depending on the translation of the Latin term virtutes morales, you can speak of ethical or moral virtues. It's the same. The question arises, how can this fact be reconciled with Aquinas' categorical statement that every virtue is either intellectual or moral? Thomas considers the division of virtues into moral and intellectual to be sufficient, because as he states, virtue is a skill that perfects man in good action. And in man, there are only two sources of human actions as human, the mind and desire. Therefore, each virtue perfects one of these two factors. It is perfect. If it perfects the mind in the theoretical or practical order in relation to good, it will be an intellectual virtue. If it perfects desire, it will be a moral virtue. The situation is a result of the unique nature of the virtue of prudence, which, while essentially being a faculty that perfects human practical knowledge, also influences the proper orientation of desire. Therefore, as Thomas states, among virtues of the mind, prudence alone, because of its substance, also belongs in a way to the moral virtues. Thomas also addresses this issue in his commentary on Aristotle's Ethics, in which he states that prudence is not only in reason itself, but also has something in appetite. Thomas considers prudence the most essential virtue in human life, arguing that a good life consists in good conduct, that assessment of which depends not only on what one does, but also on the way in which the intended goal is achieved. Good conduct requires, as Aquinas explains, not only that the goal be right, but also that the appropriate means be subordinated to the goal in order to achieve it. Therefore, as he states, it is necessary for reason to have a mental virtue that would perfect it in the right relationship to means. And this is precisely the task of prudence, which is thus a virtue necessary for a good life. The special role of the virtue of prudence is reflected in its designation as auriga virtutum, charioteers of virtues, referring to Plato's Phaedrus, in which the course of human life is metaphorically presented as a chariot drawn by two horses. Sensory and intellectual memory, human memory as a storehouse of images and concepts. Philosophical reflection on the phenomenon of memory distinguish two basic types, sensory memory and intellectual memory. Aristotle defines memory as a fixed image considered as a picture of the object from which it originates. Memory understood in this way refers to past events and as such remains a poverty of sensory cognition, which is why it is not something specifically human. Memory, Aristotle explains, even that which deals with intellectual matters, cannot do without imagination. Hence, the clear conclusion that memory only incidentally belongs to reason, but by its nature is a property of the primary sensory faculty. For this reason, it is also found in some other animals, and not only in humans. Numerous examples from everyday life confirm the fact that more highly developed animal organisms also show the ability to react, demonstrating that they associate currently perceived stimuli with those remembered from the past. Well-known examples in this context include the signs of joy shown by dogs when they smell a person associated with previous pleasant situation, such as receiving food, playing, going for a walk, etc. Or conversely, signs of hostility when associated with past experience remembered as unpleasant or even painful. Sensory memory stores past impressions, which are recalled through association. The fact that humans as rational animals also have similar sensory memory seems to explain the widespread tendency to anthropomorphize various animal behaviors, expressed in statements about animals that they understand, anticipate, know, etc. Specifically, human ability, however, is mental memory, which stores not impressions and the images based on them, but cognitive forms extracted from things by the intellect in the process of abstraction. Memory understood in this way belongs, as Aristotle states, to the rational part of the soul, which he calls the repository of forms. Aristotle clearly states that only the intellectual part of the soul can be such a place. These forms constitute the basis for performing complex mental activities in the form of reasoning and making judgments, as well as remaining an indispensable tool from the point of view of shaping the virtue of prudence. Aristotle puts it in this way. It is proper to reason to distinguish between good and bad things, those that deserve to be chosen in life and those that should be avoided. St. Thomas expresses a similar opinion on this matter, noting the fact that memory is a function of the potential intellect, enabling the permanent storage of cognitive forms of which we are not currently aware. Like Aristotle, Aquinas also points to the important role that memory plays in various manifestations of human intellectual activity, constituting in particular an indispensable condition for prudent action. Thomas also points to a structural difference in the functioning of sensory and mental memory in humans, related to the fact that the former uses images, while the later uses concepts. Images and concepts come from two different cognitive faculties, sensory and mental. We have in common with animals, Thomas notes, that memory in which particular impressions are stored. However, this memory is not found in the mind, but only that in which intellectually knowable forms are stored. Aquinas notes, however, that despite the differences indicated, sensory and mental memory in humans do not function independently of each other. On the contrary, their functional unity can be observed. According to Thomas, the interaction between sensory memory and the intellect is indicated by the fact of reminiscence, which consists in directing previously accumulated images made possible by accompanying reflection or consciousness, something also called memory of oneself. And the last point, Histories Magistra Vitae, the role of memory from the perspective of choosing the right means to achieve the intended good. Aquinas draws attention to the important role of memory in the context of the virtue of prudence in his commentary on ethics, and presents this issue in more detail in his Summa Theologica, listing memory as the first of the so-called partes integrales, components of the virtue of prudence. Thomas rejects the objection that memory cannot be a part of prudence because it concerns past events, while prudence concerns what is yet to be done, what is currently being considered. He explains that prudence concerns non-essential activities that may or may not occur, and that is appreciated to be guided by rules of statistical nature, which prove effective in most cases. As Aquinas notes, we learn about the truth of such principles through experience, which is why, quoting Aristotle, he states that cognitive virtue arises and grows through long experience. It is precisely because experience arises from the sum of many numbered things that it can be obviously be concluded, as Thomas concludes this argument, that prudence requires the memory of many things, and therefore memory is a necessary component of it. The task of memory is therefore to store past experiences so that they can be used to make the right choices regarding future actions. This is not just about the mental memory of general rules to conduct, which are relatively easy to learn, but about the countless details of everyday life around us, knowledge of which is indispensable for the proper management of one's own conduct. While some of these details are relevant from the point of view of the virtue of prudence, there are also so many that, although variable and unnecessary, recur and condition our action. It is these details that human memory should assimilate and store so that they can be accessed and used in situations where appropriate decisions need to be made in similar circumstances. Aquinas' Aretological reflection, in which memory is presented as an indispensable condition for prudent behavior, seems to confirm the accuracy of Cicero's well-known maxim, personifying historical memory as magistra vitae, the teacher of life. Thank you very much.